Have you ever imagined a monk eating like a king? At Westminster Abbey in the late 15th century, the air wasn't filled with prayers, but with the scent of roasted meat and freshly baked bread. Welcome back to Dark Historia, where we uncover the forgotten truths behind history's most sacred facades. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and let the shadows of the past draw you in. While most of medieval Europe starved, the monks of Westminster enjoyed daily feasts. Over 1 kilogram of soft bread, 5 eggs, and nearly a full kilogram of meat, replaced by salted fish only on holy days. And that's not counting the vegetables, or the endless mugs of ale that washed it all down. 6,000 calories a day, enough to make even saints swollen with sin. These weren't humble servants of God anymore, but men of flesh and indulgence. By the end of the 15th century, the monks of Westminster were not only holy, they were obese, arthritic, and chained to the very excess they once vowed to renounce. Tonight, we step inside the candlelit halls of the Abbey, where prayer met gluttony and salvation drowned in ale. This is the monks who ate like kings. At dawn, the bells of Westminster Abbey toll like the heartbeat of an empire that has long forgotten its sins. The year is 1490. The air is cold, heavy with the scent of damp stone and burning tallow. In the dim corridors, shadows of monks glide silently, heads bowed, lips murmuring Latin prayers that echo like ghosts trapped in the vaults above. They rise before sunrise to greet God, but in truth, what they greet first is hunger, and not the kind of hunger born from poverty, but from abundance. Because here, in the richest monastery of England, holiness comes served on silver platters. While peasants outside scrape the frost from their porridge bowls, these men of God begin their day with a breakfast fit for kings. Each monk receives more bread in a single meal than a farmer's family might see in a week. Over a kilogram of soft, warm loaves, freshly baked from the abbey ovens. Beside it, 5 eggs, gleaming in bowls of pewter. And for those not burdened by fasting, nearly a kilogram of meat, salted beef, roasted mutton, or whatever the Lord provides that season. When the church bells ring again for matins, the chant that fills the hall sounds divine, but the air smells of roasted flesh. Their robes hide bellies heavy with indulgence, their knees red and swollen from both prayer and the weight they carry. In the shadow of the altar, they whisper about purity. By the end of the 15th century, Westminster Abbey was no longer a fortress of faith. It had become a kingdom within a kingdom, one that answered not to God, but to its own appetite. Every meal was a ceremony. The monks dined beneath vaulted ceilings, golden candlesticks glimmering against walls painted with scenes of divine mercy. But the mercy that ruled here was hunger. Ale flowed like holy water. The brewery beneath the abbey worked day and night, its barrels rolling down stone corridors, filling the air with a thick, sweet stench of yeast and malt. The average monk consumed nearly a gallon of beer every day, not for pleasure, they claimed, but for health. And perhaps they were right, for the water of London was poison. So, beer became their salvation, and their downfall. In the scriptorium, where monks once copied the Bible by candlelight, you could now hear the sound of burping more than prayer. Fat fingers stained with ink turned to pages of holy texts, smudged not by devotion, but by grease. These men of the cloth were no longer shepherds of the soul. They were lords of indulgence, wrapped in wool instead of velvet. Archaeologists who later unearthed the bones beneath Westminster found proof of this decay. Their skeletons told a grotesque truth. Almost every monk was obese. Joints were swollen with arthritis, spines curved under the weight of excess, and bones bore the scars of a lifetime spent kneeling, not in humility, but under their own heaviness. They prayed on cold stone floors, yes, but they prayed for forgiveness, not discipline, because inside these walls, sins were whispered, not confessed. Outside, famine swept across England. Inside, the abbey kitchens roared with fire and laughter. While the poor begged for bread, the brothers argued about whether goose or venison should be served for supper. In a house of God, gluttony wore a halo. The church bells still rang every hour, but their sound no longer called to heaven. It echoed only through corridors fattened with silence and pride. And yet, the corruption that began with bread and beer would soon reach even higher, to gold, politics, and the throne itself. Because when faith becomes wealth, the line between prayer and power disappears. The collapse of faith. By the end of the 15th century, Westminster was drowning, not in water, but in its own excess. The bells still rang for prayers, but the echoes no longer reached heaven. Inside the abbey, marble floors cracked under the weight of golden altars. Monks who once vowed poverty now fought for property, and prayers had become a form of trade, a whispered bargain between guilt and gold. Donate for your soul, they said, and sinners paid, not in tears, but in silver. Forgiveness was now something you could buy, if you were rich enough to afford salvation. The abbey's kitchens, once filled with hymns, now hissed with the sound of dripping fat. Ale flowed like holy water, and the scent of meat replaced the smell of incense. Outside, the plague stalked the streets. Bodies lay under frost, and the poor buried their dead in silence. The same silence that echoed inside Westminster, where faith had been replaced by appetite. Then, the storm came. A man named Martin Luther nailed his fury onto a church door in Wittenberg, and in that single act, centuries of rot began to crack open. Across Europe, whispers turned to fire. Priests fled, abbeys burned. The sacred walls that had once held the songs of devotion now trembled with the cries of the betrayed. And Westminster, that glittering fortress of faith, stood as a monument to hypocrisy, a tomb of prayers unanswered, a cathedral of guilt. In the end, no one remembered the monks' names, only the weight of their bellies, only the silence of their empty confessions. And somewhere, deep beneath the abbey's stones, among the bones of men who once feasted for God, you can still hear it, the sound of a knife scraping a plate, a prayer swallowed by hunger. History remembers kings and queens for their crowns, but it forgets the monks who prayed with greasy hands. Westminster still stands today, its stones gleaming under the London sky, its choirs echoing hymns of purity. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the whispers of the old abbey, the clinking of goblets, the scraping of knives, the silent prayer that was never meant for God, but for hunger and forgiveness. Because in the end, faith is not lost in war or fire. It dies quietly, one bite, one sip, one sign at a time. If you want to keep uncovering the truths buried beneath marble and myth, subscribe and step with us deeper into the shadows of history, where holiness and hunger once shared the same table.